is Tom Ford. I work with a small group of equally interested parties on a website called County Asylums. And what this website does is focus on the history of what was founded from something called the County Asylum Act in 1808. And it's looking at the care of people with mental health issues, how the creation of the asylums came about, what caused or what invoked the County Asylum Act to be created, and then looking at how they were built. And there's some quite groundbreaking architectural aspects of how they were built, and a lot of the aspects from that are still evident in hospital builds today. And then obviously how the asylums changed over the years, people's understanding of both how the asylums worked and also the people in them, to the point where treatments got more advanced. We understood a lot better how to deal with these things, and then obviously that's evolved into now what we have is a sort of a community care based system, and the majority, there are still some, the majority of the asylums sort of closed, some of them almost 40 years ago now. So there were obviously, if you go right back to sort of the 13th century, there were the likes of Bethlehem, which obviously is a famous, very famous hospital, and it sort of it started the word Bedlam, and that's sort of where the word Bedlam came from, was from Bethlehem Hospital, and that was opened in sort of the 13th century, and it was built as a priory, as it was known back then, and it sort of admitted patients from the sort of 14th century. But it wasn't until the 18th century that we actually started looking at how to deal with mentally ill people. And the first act before the County Asylum Act, there was something called the Madhouse Act. And this was to deal with, actually, that before, this was back in 1774, there were a lot of non-licensed practitioners who ran madhouses just as basically making a way of making money. They had little regard to the people in them, and you know, people would be, as horrible as it sounds, be chained to the walls, or they would do 20 hours, you know, a lot of work, just for basically a roof over their head. So this act was probably the first part of actually dealing with mentally ill, and what that established was a sort of a proper licensing requirement for housing insane patients. But it wasn't until 1808 there was something called the County Asylum Act, which was passed in government, and what that did is it allowed, well, it specified two things. It really specified that each county in the country should look after their own. So what it wanted each county to do was build their own asylum, as they were termed, to look after their own patients, because until, still talking in 19th century here, there were very little mental health establishments. But the 1808 Act had flaws, and it didn't really actually achieve what it wanted to do. It allowed the counties to take a levy to actually build the asylums, but very few counties actually did anything at this point. It wasn't until 1845 when they were looking at it, and they revised it, and they also brought in something at the same time called the Lunacy Act. And it was at this point where we suddenly had a mass building frenzy. I won't use the best term, but this is from the 1845 onwards. For the next 50 to 60 years, we saw some 60 to 70 asylums built in the country. So every county pretty much in the country started to build them. So places like Somerset were a little bit ahead of their game, actually. So in terms of Wales, the county were already aware that there were going to be some changes to the Act in sort of the 1840s. So they started planning a few years before the Act, and they actually had their asylum up and running very soon after the County Asylum Act second revision was passed. But there's a lot in terms of at the point where they started building them, they actually built them typically to hold 300, 400 patients. Some of the bigger ones in London up to 1,500, but very soon they become very, very busy and very crowded. Unfortunately, back then they were still not, difficult how they classified whether people were mentally ill, and a lot of people would end up in these asylums for things that probably these days they wouldn't be treated as mental health. So you could end up in there for postnatal depression and all sorts of things. Epilepsy was still relatively unknown, although they went into, people with epileptics sometimes would go into different asylums. So they were typically a lunatic asylum, but you also had ones which were called mental deficient asylums. So if you go on the M32 into Bristol, you'll see Stoke Park Hospital on the hill, bright yellow, and that was a mental deficiency asylum, as it was called back then. And you had Glenside, which was a lunatic asylum on the other side of the motorway. So when they were built, the early stages, they built them to typically things like corridor plans, as they were called. So the hospital would typically be still, back in those days, split male and female. So you'd have sort of a front entrance, a grand asylum building. So if you ever see Wells, it's got that lovely front building on it. And then typically you'd have male and female to your left and your right. But in a corridor plan, there would be a corridor to all the way down either side of it. So the communications between the hospital would all be one. And it's talking about this, as times changed and there was better understandings of both mental health awareness, but also the architecture changed as well. So from those early plans, you go right through to somewhere like Barrow, which was one of the last asylums as such built, and that incorporated what was called a colony plan, where they realised that actually spreading them out into individual villas and treating it more like a relaxed atmosphere was much better in terms of the patients, and they would encourage occupational therapy a lot more going on there. But obviously, what was it like for patients? I mean, the whole asylum concept was to build a completely self-sufficient environment. They were quite often put away from towns. So obviously Wells was away in the hills. Some of the ones like Bristol, the Glenside, were obviously right in the middle. So you still had your city asylum, but a lot, if you go into Wales, you've got some like remote up in Talgarth and so forth. So they were generally kept out, away from the main hub of a city, but they were self-sufficient, so they would quite often have farms on them. They would have their own water supplies, and the patients would be encouraged to work on the farms. I say this is the part of the occupational. But hospitals would get busy, so the wards would, in a typical ward, there could be up to 50 patients, very close proximity, and there was very little variation. So I mean, they would lose track of what day of the week it was and stuff like that. But this actually, over time, they got more, I say again, understanding. So they encouraged more freedom. And I say, undertaking work and occupational therapy was a key in this. Having a typical asylum, obviously wards split into different things. So you would have like an acute ward for people who might have just been brought in, but then you would have your sick ward for people who are likely to be in there long term, and then you would have like epileptic ward. You'd have what we call now a geriatric ward, so you'd have old people in there, and obviously the treatments in these would vary. So in the early days, there wasn't a lot of treatment in terms of drugs, so you would typically have in each ward a padded cell. There may be more than one padded cell in each room. These typically, padded cell sounds like a nice comfy thing, but it was typically made out of quite tough leather stuffed with horsehair. So actually, if you ever have a pleasure of being in one in a museum, and they are actually not soft and comfy, they are, but they're there to stop the patients hurting themselves.